In June of 1990, a farm equipment dealer offered Mara Voss $40 for the grain drill sitting behind her mother's machine shed. He called it scrap. By September, after a hard storm sent brown water through the road ditches south of Fairmont, the field Mara had seeded with that same drill was still wearing a thin green cover. The neighboring field had fresh rills cut down the slope. The old drill had not performed a miracle. It had not stopped the rain. It had not made poor soil rich in one season. But it had done enough to make Mara ask a dangerous question. What if the machines everyone had stopped valuing could make a kind of farming possible that small operators had stopped being able to afford? Mara was 19 that summer, narrow-shouldered, grease under her fingernails more often than polish, and already tired of being told that the future of farming always seemed to arrive with a payment book attached to it. Her mother, Ellen Voss, farmed a little under 200 acres outside Fairmont, Nebraska. Corn and soybeans on most of it, a few acres of alfalfa, and a small cow-calf herd that was just large enough to create daily work and just small enough to never justify a hired man. Ellen had taken over the place after Mara's father left farming for a construction job in Colorado. There had been no dramatic family break, no funeral, no bank auction, no villain. There was simply a farm that still needed to run and one parent who stayed. Mara had grown up in that kind of reality. If a hydraulic hose burst, nobody made a speech about adversity. They replaced it. If a storm laid corn flat, they walked the rows, estimated what could still be harvested, and adjusted. If the money was short, they did not pretend it wasn't. They decided what could wait. What had bothered Mara since the drought years at the end of the 1980s was that the soil itself seemed to be moving into the category of things people expected to wait. After hard rain, water ran off parts of their south field faster than Mara remembered from childhood. In dry weather, the same ground sealed hard on top. On the steeper rows, residue washed into little piles. Nothing looked catastrophic. That was almost the problem. A fence falling down demanded attention. A bearing screaming demanded attention. Soil losing a little structure year after year did not scream. It just became more expensive. Mara first started thinking about cover crops because of a bulletin left on a folding chair at a county soil meeting. Most of the farmers at the meeting were there for the free coffee and the discussion about fertilizer prices. Mara was there because her mother had asked her to pick up a packet of forms. The bulletin described keeping living roots in the ground outside the main cash crop season: cereal, rye, oats, clover in the right rotation. The claims were careful. Cover crops could protect soil from erosion, recycle nutrients, add root mass, and improve soil condition over time. They could also create problems if they were planted badly, terminated too late, or treated like a magic trick. That last part interested Mara as much as the benefits. Anything that came with warnings usually meant it was real. She took the bulletin home. Then she went looking for the machine it assumed a farmer could use. That was where the economics broke down. The newer no-till drills she saw advertised were excellent machines, heavy, precise, built to cut through residue and place seed at consistent depth. They were also far beyond what Ellen Voss was willing to spend on a practice they had never tried. Hiring a custom operator was possible, but small fields and awkward schedules made them low priority during the narrow windows when everyone wanted work done at once. Mara asked one operator what he would charge to come out for fewer than 40 acres. He gave her a number, then added, apologetically, that he had to cover travel and setup whether he seeded 40 acres or 400. Mara understood. The math simply did not care that their farm was small. A week later, at an estate auction outside Geneva, she saw a 10-foot pull-type grain drill sitting behind a row of better equipment. It had weathered red paint, narrow steel wheels, a rusted seed box lid, and a set of double-disc openers that looked as though they had spent more time in weeds than in soil during the previous decade. The drill was old enough that nobody there had come specifically to buy it. Mara did. She paid $65. Her mother stared at the drill when Mara towed it into the yard behind the pickup. "Does it work?" Mara looked at the missing seed tubes, the frozen drive chain, and the mouse nest packed under one end of the seed box. "Not yet." Ellen folded her arms. "That's different from yes. It's also different from no." Ellen looked at her daughter for another second, then walked back toward the house. "Keep it out of the way of the planter." That was permission. The first thing Mara discovered was that an old grain drill could look simple while hiding a dozen small ways to be wrong. The seed box itself was intact. The frame was straight. The wheels turned. Those were the expensive truths. The rest was a collection of ordinary failures. Several flexible seed tubes had split from age. One opener bearing dragged. The fluted feed cups under the seed box were packed with dust and old treatment residue. The chain that drove the metering shaft had enough slack to climb teeth under load. Two opener springs had lost tension. One seed gate had been replaced with a homemade piece of sheet metal that looked close to correct until Mara measured it. She spent evenings in the shop with the drill manual, a wire brush, kerosene, calipers borrowed from her high school shop teacher, and a legal pad. She did not know every answer. That was different from the way people later told the story. Years afterward, farmers would say Mara could look at a machine and understand it instantly. She could not. She learned by making the machine explain itself. She turned the drive wheel by hand and watched which parts hesitated. She marked the metering shaft with chalk and counted rotations. She removed one feed cup and took it apart on the bench. She laid every piece in order on a shop towel, because she did not trust herself to remember how it went back together. When she needed 6 replacement seed tubes and could not find the exact original rubber, she found agricultural hose with the right inside diameter and tested whether it flexed without collapsing. When one opener bearing would not come free, she heated the housing too much, ruined the seal on the replacement, and had to buy another one. That mistake cost her $12 and an evening. She wrote it down. By late August, the drill rolled cleanly and the metering shaft turned without binding. Mara painted nothing. She did not care what it looked like. She cared whether 10 rows received 10 reasonably similar amounts of seed. That was where her first real failure began. She filled the box with rye, set the feed gates according to the faded chart under the lid, and seated a test strip behind the barn. The drill looked fine from the tractor seat. Seed dropped. Openers turned. The soil closed behind them. 2 weeks later, the problem was obvious. Some rows came up thick enough to look almost carpeted. Others had gaps. The old chart had assumed feed cups that were not worn the way hers were worn. 2 of the homemade replacement tubes were also pinching when the drill bounced, restricting flow. Mara stood at the end of the strip with her hands on her hips and felt the particular anger that comes from discovering that a machine has obeyed you perfectly while you were wrong about what you told it to do. Calvin Reed happened to see the strip 3 days later. Calvin managed sales at Prairie Implement, a dealership on the highway outside town. He had known Ellen for years and had sold the Voss family a used tractor before Mara was old enough to drive it. He was not a bully. He was not waiting for Mara to fail. He was simply a man whose working life had taught him that newer equipment usually became newer for reasons worth paying attention to. He stopped by to discuss a parts order with Ellen, saw the old drill behind the shed and walked over. "That the auction piece?" Mara said it was. He looked at the uneven rye behind the barn. "Metering's off, I know." Calvin nudged one wheel with his boot. "I could give you 40 for it as scrap." if you get tired of fighting it. Mara looked at him. I paid 65, then I'd be saving you from losing all of it. He smiled when he said it. Mara did not. Calvin pointed toward the test strip. These old boxes were never built for the kind of precision people expect now. There's a reason the good drills got heavier and more complicated. Maybe that's not an insult. That's just equipment. Mara looked back at the field. Then I need to find out how much precision the job actually needs. Calvin shrugged. Fair enough. He left with Ellen's parts order. Mara stayed with the drill. That afternoon, she did something the old rate chart never told her to do. She took the seed tubes off the openers and tied coffee cans under each outlet. Then she jacked up the drive wheel. She measured its circumference with a tape, calculated how many turns represented a known fraction of an acre, and began cranking the wheel by hand. When the cans filled, she weighed the seed from each row separately on her mother's kitchen scale. The numbers were not close, so she adjusted the feed gates, cranked again, weighed again, adjusted again. By midnight, the differences had narrowed enough that she could live with them. The next morning, Ellen found a row of dented coffee cans on the workbench, each labeled with black marker. What are those? The reason the chart was lying to me. Ellen picked up one can. Charts don't lie, fine. The chart was telling the truth about a machine I don't own anymore. That made Ellen smile. Mara seeded 22 acres after soybean harvest that fall. Not because she had proven anything, because 22 acres was what Ellen was willing to risk. They chose the sloping south field, the one most likely to show them whether the idea mattered. Mara planted cereal rye at a conservative rate. She left several comparison strips unseeded because she wanted a reference. She wrote down the date, the seed cost, the drill settings, the temperature, the field condition, and the number of wheel turns used in calibration. She did not call it research. She called it not wanting to fool herself. The rye emerged unevenly in places, but far more uniformly than the first test strip. Then winter came. The field went brown and quiet under snow. In March, the rye began growing again. By April, there was enough green between the old soybean residue that neighbors started asking what she had planted. Some liked the look of it. Some did not. One man asked why she was growing grass in a field that was supposed to grow corn. Mara told him the grass was there so the soil would have roots in it before the corn did. He said roots used water. Mara said that was true. He asked why she would want that in Nebraska. She said that was what she was trying to learn. That answer bothered people less than certainty would have. The first heavy spring rain arrived before planting. It was not a historic storm. No roofs came off. No bridges washed away. It was simply the kind of hard rain that reveals what a field does when more water arrives than the surface can take quickly. Mara drove out as soon as the rain eased. On the unseeded comparison strips, water had gathered residue into little dams, then cut around them. Fine soil settled at the lower edge of the field. Where the rye was established, the surface was not untouched, but the flow paths were shorter and less defined. Roots and stems had slowed the water enough to make the difference visible. Mara took photographs with a disposable camera. Then she cut short lengths of steel irrigation pipe, pressed them into the soil in several locations, and used them as crude infiltration rings after reading about the method in a conservation handout. She poured measured water into each ring and timed how long it took to disappear. She knew the test was rough. She repeated it anyway. The rye-covered ground generally took water faster than the bare comparison strips. Not everywhere, not by the same amount, but enough that the pattern was hard to dismiss. She wrote the times on her legal pad. Calvin Reed heard about the photographs at the cafe. He did not laugh. He said a green field was not proof that an old drill was suddenly a good drill. On that point, Mara agreed with him. The machine did not matter because it was old. It mattered because it was cheap enough to let her try the practice carefully. That distinction became the center of everything she built afterward. The first person to ask Mara to seed a field was Leon Pritchard, a hog farmer 6 miles west of town. Leon had 48 acres that washed along a shallow draw every spring. He had asked a custom operator about cover crop seeding and had been told, politely, that his acreage would have to wait until larger jobs were finished. Leon had seen Mara's rye from the road. He came to the Voss farm one evening in August and asked what she would charge. Mara had not decided she was in business, so she made the price while he stood in the machine shed. She calculated seed separately and charged enough per acre to cover fuel, wear, and her time without pretending the old drill was free to operate just because it was already paid for, Leon agreed. The job nearly ended the idea. His ground was rougher than Mara's. Cornstalk residue gathered ahead of 2 openers. A seed tube tore loose. Then a drive chain master link failed at the far end of the field. Mara had no spare. She drove home, found another link, returned, and finished after dark with the tractor lights on. The next morning she came back and walked the field. She found 2 passes where the drill had ridden high over residue and likely placed seed too shallow. She reseeded them without charging Leon. He watched her from the lane. "You always come back and check?" Mara looked at the thin line where one opener had skipped. "I do now," Leon laughed. That first customer taught her a second rule. Calibration in the shop was not enough. Every field changed the machine. Residue changed it. Moisture changed it. Slope changed it. Seed size changed it. Driving speed changed it. So Mara created a field start routine. She seeded a short distance, stopped, dug behind several openers, checked depth, checked flow, and adjusted before continuing. It cost time. It also prevented an entire field from becoming one expensive mistake. By the end of that fall, she had seeded cover crops on 4 farms besides her mother's. The acreage was small. The money was smaller. But the calls kept coming because the service solved a particular problem. Small operators did not need to own a specialized drill. They needed somebody willing to show up for 30 acres. Over the winter, Mara found 2 more abandoned box drills. One was being used as a fence behind a cattle lot. The other had been parked near a tree line since its owner bought a wider machine years earlier. She did not collect them because she loved old machinery. She collected them because the parts failures had become predictable. Metering cups, chains, seed tubes, opener bearings, springs, bent press wheel arms. The frames were usually fine. The seed boxes could often be patched. And most important, the machines were simple enough that a careful person with time could understand what was happening between the drive wheel and the seed trench. Mara bought the second drill for $90 and traded 2 days of welding work for the third. She rebuilt them during winter evenings. Instead of painting them, she marked calibration settings inside each seed box lid with grease pencil and kept separate sheets for rye, oats, and clover. She also built a rack on the shop wall for the coffee cans. Each drill had its own set. By spring, she thought she understood the system. Then the system taught her about water. One of the farms she had seeded the previous fall belonged to Don Keller, who had light ground on a ridge that dried quickly in spring. The rye stand looked excellent in April. Too excellent. Don liked the green cover and delayed killing it because he wanted more growth before planting soybeans. Mara did not object strongly enough. She was still thinking mostly about erosion and roots. Then the rain stopped. For nearly 2 weeks, wind pulled moisture out of the topsoil. By the time Don terminated the rye, the surface was drier than he wanted. Planting was harder. Emergence in one section was uneven. Don did not accuse Mara of ruining his crop. He did not need to. Mara could see the problem. The cover crop that had helped protect the field had also used water. Timing had changed the balance. That spring mattered more to Mara than the first photographs of reduced erosion. The photographs had shown that the practice could work. Don Keller's ridge showed that the same practice could become the wrong practice if she treated it as a recipe instead of a decision. Mara went back to the conservation office. She asked questions about termination timing, soil texture, spring moisture, and crop rotation. She talked to 2 farmers farther east who had been using rye longer than she had. She read more extension material. Then she changed what she sold. She stopped offering cover crop seeding as if the job ended when seed hit the ground. Instead, every field started with a simple plan. What problem was the farmer trying to solve? Erosion on a slope? Bare soil after early harvest? Compaction risk? Nitrogen management before corn? Was the ground heavy or light? Did it tend to stay wet or dry quickly? What crop would be planted next? What equipment did the farmer have for termination? If the answer to that last question was no equipment and no plan, Mara sometimes declined the job. That surprised people. She was 19 years old and trying to build a business, yet she was telling customers no. But she had learned what a bad yes cost. It cost more than losing a sale. It cost trust. By the fall of 1991, Mara was seeding for 12 farms. She still worked from the Voss machine shed. She still used old drills. She still repaired most of them herself. But the operation was becoming more organized. She kept field cards in a metal file box. Each card had the farm name, field description, crop history, soil texture as the farmer described it, seed mix, calibration setting, seeding date, problems observed, and planned spring termination window. She added a space for what actually happened the next year. That last box turned the file cards into something more valuable than invoices. They became memory. Farmers remember weather well, but memory compresses seasons. A wet April becomes that wet spring. A patchy stand becomes it didn't work great. A good field becomes that was a decent year. Mara's cards forced details to stay attached to decisions. On Leon Pritchard's place, the rye reduced visible washing along the draw, but one low section stayed wet too long in spring. On Don Keller's ridge, early termination worked better the second year. On Ellen's south field, the difference between cover and no-cover strips remained visible after hard rains. But the benefit was strongest where the stand had established before winter. On another farm, a late seeding barely emerged before cold weather and provided so little cover that Mara wrote one sentence across the card in capital letters. Too late to pretend. She did not charge that farmer full price the next year. She also stopped taking work after a cutoff date unless the farmer understood that establishment could fail. This made the service less exciting to describe. It made it more reliable to use. Calvin Reed noticed. In February of 1992, Prairie Implement hosted a customer day with coffee, donuts, machinery brochures, and several speakers. Calvin invited a representative from a drill manufacturer to discuss newer seeding equipment. Mara went because she wanted to see the opener design on a machine she could not afford. The new drill was impressive. Heavy down pressure, better depth control, stronger residue handling, more uniform metering. Mara spent 15 minutes looking under it before she went inside. During the discussion, someone asked about cover crops. The representative explained that the drill could handle them well. Then Calvin, standing beside the coffee table, added that anyone serious about consistent establishment needed serious equipment. Several farmers looked toward Mara. Calvin noticed. He had not meant the sentence as an attack, but now it sounded like one. Mara could have stayed quiet. Instead, she asked a question. Consistent compared with what? The representative asked what she meant. Mara said, "If a farmer has 300 acres and can justify this drill, I understand the advantage. But if he has 30 acres on 2 slopes, and the alternative is leaving the ground bare because he can't get a custom operator on time, What level of precision does he actually need to get a useful stand? The room became quiet in the practical way. Farm rooms become quiet when a question has a number hiding inside it. The representative did not dismiss her. He said the answer depended on species, seedbed, residue, moisture, and management. Mara nodded. That's what I've been finding. Calvin asked how many acres she had seeded the previous fall. Mara told him. He asked how she checked rate uniformity. Catch cans, weighed row by row. Somebody laughed softly at the phrase catch cans. Calvin did not. You still using that first drill? Yes. The one I offered $40 for. Yes. A few more people laughed. Calvin smiled. I may have been low. It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was movement. The real proof came that summer from weather, not from a meeting. A series of hard storms crossed the county in late May and June. Again, there was no singular disaster. The important thing was repetition. Rain struck ground that had already been saturated, then struck it again. Mara spent 2 days visiting fields she had seeded the previous fall. She photographed slopes, draws, and field edges. She checked where residue had moved. She compared areas with good cover crop establishment to late or failed stands on the same farms. The pattern was not perfect. Some covered ground still eroded where water concentrated. Some bare ground held reasonably well because slope and residue were favorable. But across the fields where cover had established well, rilling was generally less severe, and soil stayed more protected. That was the kind of result Mara trusted, not because it proved every field should be treated the same, because it showed the mechanism while preserving the exceptions. She began carrying a small steel ring, a graduated jug, a ruler, and a clipboard in the pickup. When farmers were willing, she repeated simple infiltration checks in representative spots. She never pretended the numbers were laboratory data. She used them as field comparisons. Same farm, similar soil, different management. What changed? In some places, very little. In others, enough that a farmer could see water enter one patch faster than another. Those demonstrations sold more work than any brochure could have. The winter before that, Mara nearly made a different kind of mistake. She almost expanded faster than the work could support. Once people heard she was buying old drills, they started offering them to her. A farmer near Sutton had 2 sitting in weeds. A retired operator outside Exeter had one under a lean-to. Another man called Ellen and said Mara could have a drill for free if she removed it before spring. Free sounded better than $65. Mara went to look. The seed box had rusted through along the bottom seam. 2 opener mounts were cracked. The drive wheel leaned inward because the hub was worn. The metering shaft was frozen solid. She stood beside it for 20 minutes making a parts list in her head. Then she did something she would not have done 2 years earlier. She said no. The owner looked confused. I said you can have it. I know. Free. Mara nodded. It'll cost too much. The man looked at the drill again, as though a price tag might have appeared on the rust. That evening, Mara sat at the kitchen table with Ellen and worked through every machine she owned. Purchase price, parts, hours of repair, fuel to retrieve it, trailer time, storage space, breakdowns in season, acres seeded before the machine had paid for itself. For the first time, she assigned a value to her own shop hours. The result bothered her. Some of the drills she had thought of as cheap had only been cheap because she had been pretending her evenings cost nothing. Ellen watched her erase and rewrite the numbers. You don't have to charge yourself for being alive in the shop, she said. Mara kept writing. I do if I wanted to know whether I have a business or a hobby. That winter she built a simple rule for equipment. A drill had to have a sound frame, a repairable seed box, a metering system she could understand, and parts she could either buy or fabricate without turning the machine into a custom invention. If it failed any 2 of those tests, she walked away. She built another rule for scheduling. No drill was booked as if it would run every available hour. She left repair space in the calendar. She carried spare chain, master links, bearings, seed tubes, cotter pins, grease, and 2 opener springs in the service pickup. Every machine got checked before it left the yard and again when it came back. Those rules did not make good stories at the cafe. They made the work possible in October. The first week Mara used the new system. One of the drills lost a bearing on a field 12 miles from home. Before, the breakdown would have ended the day. This time Luis had the spare in the truck, and they were running again in less than an hour. The farmer who owned the field barely noticed. That was exactly the point. Mara began to understand that reliability was not the absence of failure. Old machines would fail. New machines failed too. Reliability was how much of the failure you had already imagined before it happened. That changed the way she talked to customers. She stopped promising a date as if weather and machinery had signed the agreement. She gave a window. She explained what would make them postpone. Wet ground, seed that had not arrived, a field that was not harvested, a drill that needed a repair before the next job. Some farmers disliked the uncertainty. Most appreciated that it was named in advance. The same thinking entered the agronomy side of the service. Mara started putting a second line on every field card beneath the goal. What could make this a bad idea? On light ground, the answer might be spring moisture. On a late harvested field, it might be establishment time. Before corn, it might be termination timing and nitrogen management. On a field with no erosion problem and little residue loss, the answer might simply be that the expected benefit was too small to justify the seed and labor that year. That last answer cost her jobs. It also changed what neighbors said about her. They stopped describing Mara as the girl trying to sell cover crops. They started describing her as the person who would tell you when not to plant them. Trust grew faster after that. By the fall of 1992, Mara had 5 rebuilt drills. She hired a part-time helper named Luis Ortega, a 24-year-old mechanic who worked at a feed mill during the day and wanted extra money during seeding season. Luis was better with welding than Mara and less patient with bad bearings. He was also the first person besides Mara who could run the field start routine without being reminded. They became fast in a way that did not come from driving faster. One person could move equipment while the other calibrated. One could seed while the other checked the next field. Repairs happened before dawn or after dark. Mara raised her prices slightly because the service now included planning, field checks, and spring follow-up. A few customers left. More stayed. She was learning another uncomfortable rule. Cheap equipment could lower the cost of entry. It could not make labor free. In early 1993, Calvin Reed came to the Voss farm alone. Mara was replacing opener discs on the second drill when his pickup stopped outside the shop. He walked in carrying a manila folder. "You busy?" "Yes." Calvin waited. Mara looked up. But not too busy to talk. He set the folder on the bench. Inside were notes from one of his customers. A family operation with several smaller fields and a cattle lot. They had priced a newer drill but could not justify the purchase for the acres they wanted to seed. Calvin tapped the folder. "I told them I knew someone who might fit the job better." Mara wiped her hands on a rag. "You sending me business now? I'm trying to solve the customer's problem." "That sounds familiar." Calvin nodded. He looked at the old drill behind her. "I was wrong about one thing." Mara waited. "I thought the equipment was the point. New drill versus old drill. Better machine versus worse machine." He paused. "That's not what you're selling." Mara leaned against the bench. "No. You're selling a way for small farms to try a practice without buying the machine, and a way to avoid doing it badly." Calvin nodded again. "That too. It was a better apology than saying he was sorry." because it showed that he finally understood what he had dismissed. Mara took the folder. She did not make Calvin suffer for being late to the idea. She called the family that afternoon. The referral changed Prairie Implement too. Calvin began telling customers with enough acres to justify a newer drill exactly that. Buy the right machine if the work supports it. But when a farmer wanted to seed 40 acres, test a cover crop on a difficult slope, or learn whether the practice fit before taking on debt, he sometimes sent them to Mara. A year earlier, he would have considered that a lost sale. Now he considered it a customer who might make a better decision later. Mara respected him more for that than she would have respected a public confession. The business grew through those kinds of practical corrections. By 1994, Mara and Luis were covering farms across parts of 2 counties. The fleet had expanded to 7 drills, though only 5 were usually ready at any given time because Mara refused to schedule every machine as if nothing would break. Something always broke. Chains stretched, bearings failed, seed tubes cracked. One frame developed a weld fracture that took a full day to repair. A tractor tire went flat during the busiest week of the fall. A wet October shut down seating on ground they could not responsibly enter. Mara lost money that week. She wrote that down too. The service had never become easy. It had become understandable. That was different. The biggest change was in the way customers talked about the work. At first they asked, "Can you plant rye?" Later they asked, "What are we trying to fix in this field?" That question was worth more than any single seeding job. It meant the machine had moved into the background where it belonged. One farmer wanted to reduce erosion along a side hill. Another wanted more residue after silage harvest. Another had heavy ground that stayed wet and needed a cautious plan, not a fashionable mix. A cattle producer wanted to graze a small cover crop field, which changed species and timing considerations again. Mara did not become an agronomist by declaration. She stayed inside what she could support. When a question exceeded her knowledge, she said so and called someone who knew more. That habit protected the business from the most dangerous form of success, being right often enough to start believing you could not be wrong. In 1995, the County Conservation Office asked Mara to demonstrate her calibration method at a fall field day. She brought the first drill. It still wore most of its old paint. She jacked up the drive wheel, removed the seed tubes from the openers, and tied coffee cans beneath the outlets. A group of farmers stood around watching while she explained that the rate chart inside the lid was only a starting point. Worn feed cups changed output. Different seed changed flow. Speed and field bounce changed behavior. The only way to know what the machine was doing was to measure what came out of it. Calvin Reed was standing near the back. When Mara finished the first catch test, one row was light. She pointed to it. "This is why we check." She made an adjustment and ran the test again. The second result was closer. Nobody laughed at the coffee cans. The method was too obvious once they saw it. After the demonstration, a farmer Mara did not know asked whether an old drill could really be as good as a new one. Mara shook her head. "No, a good new drill is a better drill." The farmer looked surprised. Mara continued, "But that's not always the question. Sometimes the question is whether this old drill, calibrated and used in the right field, is good enough to let you do useful work without buying a machine you don't need." Calvin looked at her and smiled. That sentence traveled farther than Mara expected. Not because it was clever, because it gave people permission to stop arguing about old versus new and start asking about fit. The following year, Prairie Implement began setting aside certain trade-in drills, instead of sending them immediately toward salvage. Calvin called Mara when one came in with a straight frame and repairable metering system. She bought some. She rejected others. The first time she rejected one, Calvin looked almost offended. Too much rust in the box, Mara said. You rebuild everything else. That's why I know when not to. Calvin laughed. Now you sound like a dealer. Don't insult me. He laughed harder. The arrangement was useful because it created a small second life for machines that still had mechanical value but little resale appeal. It also created discipline. Mara no longer bought equipment simply because it was cheap. A cheap machine with a bad frame was expensive. A free drill with an obsolete part she could not replace was expensive. A machine that required 3 days of work to save 1 hour in the field was expensive. She had learned to calculate cost in time, not just cash. The same logic shaped the cover crop work. A seed mix could be cheap and still be wrong. A thick stand could look impressive and still create a spring problem. A farmer could save money on fertilizer in one situation and see no meaningful savings in another. Mara stopped letting people describe the service as a cure. If a customer said cover crops would fix his soil, she asked what he meant by fix. If he could not answer, they were not ready to choose a seed. That insistence slowed some sales. It also kept the practice attached to reasons. By the late 1990s, Mara's operation no longer looked like a teenager's side business. There was a second shed, a dedicated service truck, better scales for calibration, and a scheduling board that covered one wall. Luis had become a full-time partner during the busiest seasons. Ellen handled some of the paperwork in winter, though she refused to admit that she enjoyed it. The old drills remained. Some had been replaced by better used equipment as the business could afford it. A heavier no-till drill eventually joined the fleet because certain high-residue fields demanded it. Mara bought that machine gladly. She had never built an identity around being old-fashioned. She had built a habit around using the least expensive tool that could do the job correctly. Sometimes that tool was $65 and a week of repairs. Sometimes it was a modern drill that cost more than all her first machines combined. The principle did not change when the equipment did. That was the part Calvin Reed had finally understood. The story people told about Mara usually centered on the first grain drill because a rusty machine makes a better story than a field card. But Mara would have chosen the field cards. They showed the actual work, years of decisions. Late seedings that failed, early terminations that protected moisture, wet fields they stayed out of, slopes where cover reduced visible erosion, fields where the effect was modest, fields where the economics worked, fields where they did not. A practice becoming useful because somebody kept enough records to stop remembering only the successes. That was also why the original coffee cans never disappeared. They moved from the old machine shed to the new one. The labels faded. One had a split along the rim. Another had the bottom dented upward from years of being tossed into a toolbox. They were no longer the best way to measure seed. Mara had better equipment for that now. But she kept the cans on a shelf above the calibration bench. Not as decoration, as a reminder of the first field that came up wrong. The field that taught her the chart was not a command. The machine was not a symbol. And being willing to repair something old did not make her right. Measuring what it actually did was what made the work worth trusting.